You're listening to the Lion's Roar, the podcast of the Democratic Unionist Party. Today, we're turning the spotlight onto one of the most serious revelations in terms of reports that have ever come out of our health service in recent years. An investigation into the cardiac surgery unit at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast. I'm joined by one of my colleagues, Diane Dodds, MLA, who has been at the forefront of bringing this report to public attention. Dan, thanks very much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Dan, we're going to get right into it. This report has been in the media for a couple of days. What has this report revealed? What did it investigate and what did it find?
Well, this report really is a shocking litany of a culture of bullying, of junior staff feeling not valued, of even instruments being thrown in theatre during patients being anaesthetized. It is an absolutely shocking report into a culture in the workplace in the cardiac unit. And the report only deals with the cardiac unit. But of course, I believe that the report has much wider implications for the culture in the workplace within the Belfast Trust. And indeed, since this has become public knowledge, then I have had communication from trusts across Northern Ireland where people don't feel valued, don't feel that the workplace is safe, don't feel respected. And that's just not good enough in today's age, that we have a workforce who are treating patients in the most sensitive, anxious moments of their medical journey, who are in this very, very difficult situation. So the report was set up to deal with that, and to look at the culture and the safety of the team within the cardiac surgery unit in the Royal. The report actually comes and says very clearly, and I think it's important that we emphasize this. It says that the unit is safe, so I don't think we need to worry on that level. But what we do need to worry about is that culture of bullying and of staff not feeling respected in the workplace, and ultimately then the impact that that may have on patient outcomes.
Dan, there's been words like chaos used to describe the cardiac surgery unit. Can you go into a little bit more detail? Because I'm conscious you've actually seen the report itself, into what the culture was like in the unit and what it was like to work there.
The report is absolutely appalling, and I think the health minister, admitted that is appalling. It talks about surgeons bullying junior staff. It talks about arguments during surgery. It talks about implements being thrown in theatre.
It's
And
amazing.
as my colleague Alan Robinson said yesterday in the health committee, it's like something you'd find in a Wild West bar as opposed to a really serious place of work. That is very, very worrying. But actually, there are other things in the report that are systemic to the Belfast Trust that are equally worrying, and that is the failure of management to actually get to grips with the problem. This report details a certain period in time in the first quarter of this year,
Mhm.
and a quarter of this year when actually surgeons, consultant surgeons, actually thought that it was okay to say that they were working from home. Is utterly appalling. But it deals with a specific period of time in this year. But I do think that that has been, that's only a sample of
Mm,
what has been going on.
okay.
And it's been exacerbated by completely weak management in the trust, failure to deal with it. HR managers, there's great detail about HR managers who actually then just say no, no, and pass it down to junior staff to deal with it. And if we're ever to actually eradicate this behavior and encourage staff, if they feel that things are going wrong, that we have a culture of openness within our health service, if we're ever to do that, then they must deal with this particular type of behavior.
You mentioned there the HR managers who perhaps even pushed this issue down to junior members of staff, and it simply wasn't dealt with. Can I pick up on that and ask you who should have stepped in And what your view is as to why they didn't step in. Is this simply they just ignored the issue, or was there something else going on?
Well, ultimately, I think that the chief executive of the trust, the chairman of the trust board, and the minister need to get to grips with the problem. I do not for 1 minute believe that this is a new issue. I think that this is an issue. And if you listen to Unison and some of the unions, you would actually understand that they deal with these problems on a weekly basis with staff. So it's not a new issue. But what is appalling about it is the way it was allowed to continue, the way that management didn't step in. The report also talks about, having a being open framework within the trust. That should be standard practice in today's environment.
Yeah.
And there are many people who are calling for a duty of candor. And honestly, I do think that if you never ever believed in this before, reading the report and enabling people to speak up, to not fear for their careers if they do speak up, is really important in this situation.
Yeah. I have to say, my one experience of the Belfast Trust coming from this end, and it wasn't to do with cardiac surgery, was when I was a councillor, we're probably going back 6 years, I put a complaint in against the consultant. It took the trust a year and a half to investigate that. Their guidelines were it should have been investigated in 6 weeks. It took a year and a half before I was able to take that to the ombudsman, and it was only actually at that time I had to write to the permanent secretary in the Department of Health, when it was Richard Brangeli when he was there, and at that point he wrote to the chief executive, and suddenly I got something back within a week. But there does seem to be this culture of like not dealing
Bury
with,
it.
yeah, bury it,
Bury
just
it.
not deal with it because
Yeah.
it's too
Yeah.
complicated or too difficult to
But
deal
I
with.
think also, though, Peter, there will be many really, really brilliant people within our health service
There are,
today
there are
who
indeed.
will be very vexed and annoyed
Yeah,
that this is the portrayal of their profession
and it's not the
over the
case.
past week. And of course, it's not the case.
Yeah,
There are huge numbers of people who have spent their life, healing the sick and helping us all when we are in our
absolutely.
situation of most need.
Yeah,
So I think that we need to have a balance in how we look at these things and remember that the vast and overwhelming number of people who work in our health service are there for their patients. They want to see good outcomes for their
yeah,
patients, but they need to be able to say when something is going wrong. And they need to do that without fear for their own career or for bullying in the
yeah.
workplace.
Let's move on and just talk about what the impact of this is, and I mean really for parents of children who are maybe there, or patients or families, effectively who have put that their trust in the unit. I mean, have you any sense about what impact this has had? Because we've obviously covered off what the culture within cardiac surgery unit was. What about the real world impact for patients?
Well, if you are going into that unit, you're very seriously ill,
Yeah,
you're potentially unstable, you're very anxious, and your family are very anxious as well.
absolutely.
And the one thing that the report does point out is that the unit has very good outcomes and that all of their metrics are within all of the limits that would be standard for measurement.
Yeah,
What the report also says, though, and very, very important also to remember this. So there are issues in the report for staff, but there's also issues in the report for patients. And that is actually that the unit has one of the longest waiting lists in the whole of the United Kingdom, both for elective, that's planned surgery,
yeah,
and emergency surgery. And that there's a growing number of emergency cases that are coming to the unit because of the long waiting lists. And it finds no evidence that the trust have actually looked at how that long waiting list impacts mortality. And that's a very, very important issue.
that's a
And in
good
fact,
point.
the report actually goes even further and it says that the Belfast Trust should now prioritise cardiac surgery. And I hope it does. So when the minister goes and talks to the chair of the trust, I hope he not comes back with a plan, not just to deal with the toxic culture within the trust, that we have a more settled, less chaotic unit in future and indeed across the trust. But that he also has a plan to deal with waiting lists and the long, long waits that people are having for surgery that is literally life-saving.
And my understanding is that the minister is meeting the chief executive and the chair probably today to see what the trusts are going to do about this. I want to just talk briefly about accountability and really sort of what happens next. So we probably have a sense because we're in this environment. But for people out there who wonder, well, there's been a report. What does happen next? How does this get better? What needs to happen? What are you specifically hoping that that meeting will bring, and how will you continue to hold both the minister and the trust to account?
Well, first of all, the health service and the minister are one. He is responsible for the health service. So we can't actually take some of the kind of plausible deniability that the minister has been using and the shifting of emphasis to the trust really on face value.
Okay.
The department and the minister are responsible for the health service in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
The second thing is then that the trust has become are the employing body. And they really need to get to grips. So we need a plan from the trust. We need to understand what they're going to do, what they've put in place to actually sort this problem out. And the other thing then we need to do is what's the plan for patients? How do we improve outcomes? How do we provide a less chaotic environment for those patients? And how do we help the outcomes to be the best that they can absolutely be? We know the unit is safe, and that's important to keep on
Absolutely.
stressing. But it is important that we have the best outcomes for patients. Patients on long waiting lists for this kind of surgery will not have the best outcomes. We need to deal with all of those issues. So unless we see that, and unless we see that plan from the minister, really clearly and published, and I think he should be publishing it and perhaps even making a statement to the Assembly next week on the intentions to do that,
Mhm.
then we will continue to hold him to account and the trusts to account in this way.
Okay. Um, I mean, the conversation we've had today, the report into the cardiac surgery unit, isn't necessarily about exposing failure, and we know, and you've highlighted yourself in our conversation about the amazing people who work in our health
Yes,
service, and we've both personally had experiences of
yes.
that and taking kids to emergency or A&E and so forth. So it's not about, first of all, I suppose it's not about saying this is the health service and this is representative. It's absolutely not. Most people are there doing a marvelous job, but it is about restoring, I think, faith into our health service. You mentioned just in your last comment to me there about maybe making a statement. Is there a mechanism just for people's knowledge? Because again, people maybe don't know how the assembly works. Could you just briefly explain what the mechanism that you're using to hold the ministers, you said, to account on this issue?
First heard at the end of February about consultants working from home and
I mean,
operations being cancelled. I
incredible.
know it's fantastical, but that's what happened. And I've set down a series of questions to the health minister. The health minister still hasn't answered those questions
Sorry, when were those?
in March.
In March, okay.
So when I then became aware of the report, then I raised that as an urgent question to the minister in the Assembly chamber. And then we were able to raise it again with the minister in the Health Committee. So there's a really important scrutiny role
Mm-hmm.
for the Assembly in holding the minister, the department, and the trusts to account.
Yeah.
And that is the work that we do and will continue to do. But for the vast majority of people who are within our health service, they do amazing work and they really care about the outcomes for their patients. But what our job is to do is to make sure that they are able to do that in a workplace that is safe and respectful towards them.
Okay. Look, Dan, I just want to say thank you very much for all the work you're doing on this. We all know that you are brilliant in that health committee, and this is just one example of how you are, drawing these things into light. It's really, really important. I'm sure there are staff in the Royal today who really appreciate the work that you've done on this. Um, is there any sort of final message you have for our listeners today in terms of what you want to say around this? Or even if there may be people watching this who might have had experience, similar experience to this in terms of their role within the health service. I mean, what should they do if they've had that experience?
Well, funny enough, since I started talking about this, I've had a number of emails. In fact, overnight, probably about a dozen emails that actually are from people across Northern Ireland, who describe the difficult circumstances that they've found within the health service. I would encourage people to speak up, and we will be watching for how trusts actually behave
Hmm.
towards people who speak up, because it's only when we have that culture of openness that we are able to set things right. And that's the most important thing for patients and for staff. The minister talks a bit about a reset of our health service. And it's not just a reset of services, it's a reset of how we deal with the
Yeah,
staff in our health service and how we get the best outcomes for patients.
very good.
And that's what we'll be working towards.
Brilliant. And I'm guessing if anyone wants to contact Diane, you simply go to Google. Other search engines are available, but if you go into Google and type in Diane Dodds MLA, it'll take you to some details, and Dan can actually, you can send an email to Dan directly. But look, I want to thank you, Dan, for coming in today. It's been really, really interesting. We're going to be keeping a close eye on this one, especially next week as this issue continues to pan out. We'll watch for the health minister and see what he says next week on the issue. We want you, the listeners, to know that the DUP is standing with you. We will continue to provide scrutiny on these issues and other ones within the health committee. Today, you've been listening to the Lions Roar, and we just hope you'll be back soon. But thank you very much for your time, and thanks for listening.